Hey, what's up guys, Paulo Munoz here. Welcome back to another video tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to model and detail the handle of a Japanese sword inside ZBrush. Let's go ahead and jump straight into it. Alright, so this image that you can see here on the screen is what we're going to be working on today. Everything was done in ZBrush except the textures that were done inside Substance 3D Painter. But all the details of the kind of like overlapping pattern of the threads, that's all ZBrush using the techniques that I'm going to show you today. Alright, let's jump into ZBrush. And I'm using the standard UI that comes with ZBrush just so that you can follow along a little bit faster. And this is just a reference model of the type of things that we're going to be creating today. So again, the pattern looks a little bit complex, and especially the overlapping kind of like threads is, is something that might take a little bit of time if you want to do it manually. But with the technique that I'm going to show you is very, very easy. So let's jump right into it. So I'm going to click on the Cylinder 3D from the tool palette just to select a cylinder 3D, and I also have the perspective off, and I also going to enable polyframe with the Shift F, and that's it. Let's go ahead and bring in the Gizmo 3D, and I'm going to use the Y-axis to push this up a little bit, and this is going to determine the size of the hilt of the sword, or in a katana I believe it's called the Tsuka. So this is going to be the length of it, so you can push it up depending on the reference you have, or if you're making your own, feel free to play around with the size. Now let's go to the subtool palette, and I'm just gonna take this cylinder and duplicate it once. And this duplicate is what we're gonna be using to create that, that pattern. So I'm gonna hold the Control and Shift to access my selection tools, and I'm gonna select just one polyloop, like so. We can also go into solo mode. I have that mapped to my letter S, so I'm just gonna press S, this button right here. And that also allows me to see just this section. And if for some reason you don't see the behind of the polygon, or a single-sided polygon, that is at the bottom of the tool palette. We can scroll to display properties, click on double, and that way you can see behind, or like the inside normals basically. And that's it. The next thing is to get rid of the rest that we don't need. So right now, if I hold Control and Shift, click and drag, we basically have the other parts still available to us, but they're just hidden. So in order to remove them, we can go to the Geometry palette, then open up the Modify Topology. All of this is still under the Tool palette, and I want to click on Delete Hidden. That's it. So now we have removed the rest. Now, what I want to do is create a gap in here so I can connect things a little bit better. So you can do this in different ways. Again, you can hold Control and Shift and hide portions that you don't need, right? And then you can, like let's say if I want to remove this, you can just go ahead and click on Delete Hidden. Alternatively, we can enable Transform, activate Symmetry in the X-axis, and we can go to the brush thumbnail here, select the ZModeler, which is the one or the tool that we're going to be using for the rest of the process. So that's why we can choose it right now, and then hold the Alt key to tag, let's say 6 polygons, right? And then I'm going to hover over these polygons, press the spacebar, and I'm just going to click on Delete as my polygon action. And it doesn't matter what target you choose because we have manually tagged those polygons with the Alt key, and click once, and that's it. We have deleted those. So it's the same thing as hiding them and then deleting them. All right, the next thing is to add a polyloop right in the middle. So I'm going to hover over an edge, press the spacebar, insert multiple edge loops. So I'm going to click and drag, and this is the one that allows us to do this type of thing, but I'm just going to concentrate on a single edge loop. Now, you might see that if you press the spacebar, you have the option to add a single edge loop. The reason I selected the multiple edge loop, even though I have a single one, is because with this tool, it allows me to create that edge loop right in the middle of the polygon. So we know that the top and bottom are exactly the same width. All right, the next step would be to hover over the edge again, press the spacebar or right click, select the bevel tool, and click and drag. So just gonna add a little gap in here, something tiny like that. Maybe that's too much. Something like this, right? Just enough so that we can basically have 1, 2, and 3 different edge loops here that then we can connect. So now we can hover over this edge, right click, go to Bridge, Edges. And before I do the next step, I'm just gonna go to Transform, activate Symmetry to get rid of symmetry, click at the bottom edge, and then at the top edge, like so, and that creates a bridge between these two polygons. Now we can add a few more polygons in here. So I'm gonna right click or press the spacebar, go to Insert, Multiple Edge Loops, click and drag. I'm gonna set this to 5. yeah, something that is like an odd number. The reason I don't want an even number is because I don't want to have a line right in the middle. And just let me show you what that means. If I go ahead and click and drag and create, let's say 6, right? If I look at it from the center, we're going to have this line right in the middle, okay? So when I do the next one, let's say bridge this edge with this edge, same thing, right click, insert, and multiple edge loops. You'll see we have a line that is right in the middle. So under the geometry palette, you can expand mesh integrity. And if I click on check mesh integrity, we're going to have this issue, right? And it's telling me that the current mesh has one or more edges that are shared with more than 2 polygons. So that is that edge right in the middle, right? So that's going to become a problem once we want to, modify things and overlap these things a little bit, because these points right here are merged together. They're welded together. So the way that you avoid that is to not have an edge right in the middle. So let's undo that. Let's click on the edge, insert multiple edge loops, click and drag, and we can go for 7, no problem, because again, there's no points right in the middle. And that's pretty much it. What I want to do before I connect the top and bottom of the other side is to assign a polygroup. And the way that I can assign that is holding Control and Shift and clicking on this point, right? It's a point that is shared with the yellowish and bluish tones, like as in the 2 different polygroups, and then I can hold Control and W, right? Maybe Control W a few more times just to give a different color so that you can see the difference between the pink and the yellow one. And now I can replicate the same process. So hover over an edge, go to bridge, click bottom, top, that connects it. Now I can press spacebar again, insert multiple edge loops, and this time I only need to click once, okay? And this is one of the cool things about the ZModeler, that it will remember your previous settings, or the previous, let's say, distance or amount of subdivisions that you created with the tool. So we have exactly the same amount. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing, hold Control and Shift, click on this point that is shared by these 2 polygroups, Control W a few times, just to have something different in terms of color. And now we are pretty much ready to go. All right, so there's still some coplanar issues in here, but don't worry, this is part of the process. We're gonna fix that in just a second. So the next step would be to adjust the curvature of this cylinder. So if I go to the top, right, and I press the Shift key, it looks like nothing is in there. And that is because it is a single-sided mesh, right? So we cannot see the thickness. So we're gonna go to the geometry palette, open up the dynamic subdivision, click on dynamic, right? And we're gonna remove the subdivision. So this slider, set it to 0, and the thickness, we can add a bit of thickness. And this is dynamic, meaning that none of these changes are actually happening. This is just dynamically drawn on top. But what's cool about this is that if I rotate now, hold Shift, you will be able to see the subdivision. So you will be able to see the points. So what I wanna do is maintain that roundness of the cylinder, right? So now what I can do is hold the Control key, click and drag, and mask those points. Hold Control, click once in the canvas to invert the selection or invert the mask. And then I can bring in the gizmo, click on this icon right here, go to Unmask Center Mesh, and I can push this like so, right? If I get out of solo mode, I will be able to see the additional cylinder I had. So I can just push this along there. Let's go back into solo and do the same thing. I'm going to hold Control, click, and mask these points. Control, click, and mask these points. Get out of solo mode, and it's basically rinse and repeat. That's about it, right? So now when I get out of solo mode, this is more of a rounded shape, which is what I wanted, and I still have all these polygons. All right, the next thing I want to do is separate this a little bit. So I'm going to turn off the dynamic for the time being, and I'm going to hold Control and Shift to isolate this polygroup. This is the reason I gave them different polygroups. And now I can mask this entire thing, holding Control, click and drag, or I can just click once and it will be, ZBrush will mask whatever is on the canvas. And I can bring back the rest, hold Control, click once, and it will be inverted. And now I can just mask these points just to make sure that we don't mess with those corners. And then with the gizmo selected, center to the unmasked areas, I'm gonna go ahead and move this back a little bit, so we don't have that jittering effect anymore. And if anything, we can just flatten it a little bit just by pressing this Z axis a bit, right? So I just want to create a little bit of a gap, not too much. And if I enable dynamic again, you'll see with the thickness, it kind of looks all right, okay? So that's all I wanted. Cool. So now let's get rid of dynamic subdivision again. the next set of edge loops are going to determine how many threads you want. So if you want 4 like I have here, you need to create 4 in here and 4 at the bottom, right? So let me just show you what that means. I'm going to right click or press a spacebar on an edge, go to insert, multiple edge loops, and I can click and drag, and that's about it. I can let go now, and you'll see maybe the polygroups are a little bit hard to see. So I'm going to hold Control and Shift, isolate this polygroup, hold Control and W, and there we go. So the pink one is the one that I'm referring to. So the amount of edge loops that you set up in this stage is the amount of threads that you're going to have around the pattern, right? So make sure that you decide that before you go into this step. Now, the next thing I want to do is duplicate this whole thing, just because I want to be able to show you 2 alternatives of the end result. So I'm going to go to the Subtool palette, and I'm just going to rename this one option 1, and then I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to rename it option 2. Okay, let's hide option 2 and go to option 1. And this is purely just as an extra. You don't have to do this step. Just I want to show you the alternative later. So with option 1, we can just hover over any face, press a spacebar, and I'm going to select the extrude option and polygroup all. Now you can also use QMesh for this action. However, the extrude version is better because with QMesh, ZBrush tends to weld some of the points that are closer together, and we don't want that. So make sure that it's extrude and polygroup all, and polygroup all as the target tells ZBrush that we want to use this action, the extrude action, in just the polygroup that we select first. So I'm going to click on the pink one and push that out just to give it thickness. And that's perfect. We still have some overlapping here. We're going to fix that next, but this is looking good. We're going to go ahead and open up the geometry palette, and I'm going to click on dynamic. And this error that we see here, that's the reason I duplicated this mesh to show you the difference. So this is not a big deal, but right now the problem, or not the problem, but this warning that we're getting is that this polygroup, the kind of like light green or almost yellow polygroup, is actually shared by more than two faces. So that's the issue that we're getting. But again, it's not a big deal. We can just click anywhere and ZBrush is still going to do it. Obviously, the settings are not great. So let's remove the thickness altogether, because the thickness, that's what we just did. And we can click on the smooth subdivision just to give it a bit of smoothness. So a smoothness of 3 looks all right. And we are getting pretty close. So now what I want to do is move this out of the way so that it looks nicer. So I'm going to use the Move Topological. So this one right here. You can also access that brush by hitting the letter B, M, T. And with a larger brush size, what I'm going to do is hold the Alt key and push this one towards the camera. Holding Alt with the move brushes allows you to move things along their normals. So that's what I'm doing right here. And if anything, we can just move with a smaller brush size just to adjust this. So this is probably the only kind of like manual work to do just to refine this. Maybe from the inside, we can push this in. And the reason I chose the Move Topological is because the Move Topological respects the continuity of topology. So in other words, if I click on these points that I'm basically moving around, because they're not directly connected to the ones at the top, or they're not close to the ones at the top, it's not going to move them. So that is a lot easier to sort of manipulate. Another thing I want to do is just give this a tiny bit of curvature. Again, this is kind of like up to you. And that's looking pretty good. But if you compare it with this, it's a little bit far from this, right? Because this looks like it's actually tied together and it's, it feels solid. Whereas in this case, it doesn't. So the simple solution, or what you can do next, is go to the Deformation palette and click on Inflate. So I'm going to click on Inflate, or click and drag in this slider, and I'm just going to tie these things together. And that is pretty much it. We have completed the tutorial. Let's go ahead and change this to a basic material so that you can see it. And this is looking pretty good. And yeah, I'm just going to show you the alternative to this, just so that you know that if you don't want to have those kind of like issues at the back, in this case, you won't see it, right? When we duplicate it and we bring in the handle, you won't see any of that. So you can sort of create a low poly mesh and then bake all those details if you want to take this into a game engine. But just to show you the alternative, we're going to select this option 2, go into solo mode, bring in the polyframe again. So the simple alternative is to, once you get to this stage, you can hold Control and Shift to isolate this polygroup, the one, the outermost polygroup, right? So the pink one, and then go to geometry, modify topology, delete hidden. So we now only have these pieces kind of like floating around, these kind of like rings. And then we can go to dynamic. We can play with the thickness dynamically. So that's another plus of this additional workflow. And then we can click on smooth subdivision. So we can do that. And if it is too sharp, as you can see here, that has to do with the post subdivision on the dynamic subdivision. So we can click on that just to turn it off. And there we go. We have these nice lines. And obviously to make them thicker, we can also go to the deformation palette. So the rest of this process is pretty similar. Before we inflate, we have to apply the dynamic subdivision. So yeah, let's just go ahead and click apply. So now we have subdivision levels, as you can see. And we can now go to the inflate. And now it's inflating along the normals. And again, we can go back to the highest subdivision level. And we have something pretty similar. Again, we can go back and tweak this, overlapping a little bit with the move topological. But yeah, as you can see, two similar options. We can subdivide this even more just to get a little bit like softer. But you have two options that work really well. Like I said, I prefer to use the option 1, even though there's like some issues at the back, just because in a scenario like this, I wouldn't actually have that many pieces of geometry unless it's like a highly detailed sculpt. But you know, I can just basically bake all those details into a low poly mesh. All right, so a couple more things just to wrap up this tutorial, and this is completely up to you. I'm just gonna show you how to duplicate this pattern really easily. So I'm gonna bring in the gizmo. I have the option 1 selected, so I'm gonna push this down bottom. You can use the array mesh, actually, and you can click on array mesh, and you can just add as many repeats as you want, and then you can use in the offset the y-axis. So the y-axis would be the green one, right? So you can just go y-axis, which is this one, and increase the offset, right? So that's kind of like a dynamic way of doing it around there, and that's it, right? Obviously I did too many, so I can dynamically change the amount and then adjust. So that's a very simple way of doing it. The cool thing about this workflow is that not only this is dynamic, so if you turn off array, you only have one pattern to deal with, but you can also turn off dynamic and you still be able to change this on the fly. So that's pretty handy, okay? So let's go back and set it to array. An alternative to this would be to, let's actually duplicate this just to give you an extra tip. Select that one. I'm gonna turn off array mesh. And instead of using array mesh, I'm gonna bring in the gizmo and I'm gonna hold Control and click the arrow in the y-axis. This allows me to sort of like duplicate along this axis. And what I'm gonna do before I let go of the click or the Control key is just to set the distance around there. Okay, so again, holding Control and dragging, just determine the distance between the two. And now that I have determined the distance, before I let go of my click, I'm gonna let go of Control and then I'm gonna keep pushing up. And there we go. So that way you can make sure that you duplicate this consistently. So that's a really nice technique. Again, sort of like holding Control, click and drag to duplicate, then let go of Control. And as long as you just keep going in the direction, ZBrush is going to duplicate that mesh. And that's about it, right? One thing, in case you want to do it, is, you know, if you look at the references of the hilt of that katana sword, is not necessarily cylindrical in nature. So what you can do as well is merge things together. So for example, let's actually undo one of these because I had too much and a little bit. All right, so there we go. And then the cylinder that we're using as a reference, we can also use the dynamic subdivision. Oh, actually we need to create a polymesh 3D out of this, right? So that we can play around with this. I'm gonna copy it from the subtool palette, go back to where we were, paste it in here. And now we can go to the geometry and we can click on dynamic. And if you don't want to see this, we're kind of like triangulation here, we can enable polyframe, bring in the ZModeler, add a couple of loops in there and a couple of loops in here, and maybe one at the bottom and at the top here. So that's just to sharpen those. Again, all of this is up to you. But what I would do is combine these two together. So I can hold Control and E in my keyboard, which is what I have assigned to merge down, or you can just leave the two that you want to combine and click on merge visible, and ZBrush will create a new tool. Of course, it just removes the dynamic subdivision, but we can just enable it again, and that's all good. So now we have the dynamic subdivision here. And what I was talking about, the kind of like the non-cylindrical shape, the reason I merged everything together is so that you can do it a lot easier. So let's turn off dynamic. Let's bring in the gizmo, center to the unmasked areas, click on the gear icon, and I'm going to use the soft or deformer soft. Let's go ahead and actually rotate around. And this deformer soft is kind of like a lattice, if you're familiar with the term. I'm going to mask and then, or hold control to mask and then the Alt key. And that way we only mess with these points, and we can scale within this area with the Z axis. So you see it's like changing that sort of circular shape, and we can go ahead and click accept now. If anything, we can scale this even more like so. So that is not a cylindrical shape, it's more like the real shape. We can click on dynamic. Again, it's gonna give you always this issue or this warning, but like I said, it's not a big deal. And there we go. We have a katana that we can, continue working. And obviously you can separate this again, add some details to the inner side, or the kind of like the wood or metal that goes underneath the wrapping. But that's pretty much it. Hopefully you find this tutorial useful. Let me know what you think. And if you do something following this tutorial, feel free to share as well. I would love to see it. All right, I'll see you in the next tutorial. Cheers.